They called him crazy, paranoid, a doomsday fanatic wasting his life on fantasies that would never come true. For 3 years, Marcus had endured the laughter, the sideways glances, the whispered jokes at the hardware store when he'd show up for another load of insulation or ventilation equipment. His neighbors would shake their heads as truck after truck delivered materials to his property on the outskirts of town. What was he building out there? And more importantly, why? Marcus never bothered to explain himself anymore. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, after the first few attempts to share his vision had been met with outright mockery. An underground shelter? In Montana? What are you preparing for, Marcus? Nuclear war? Aliens? They'd laugh, slap him on the back, and walk away convinced he'd lost his mind. His own brother had stopped returning his calls. His sister-in-law had forbidden him from discussing his project at family gatherings, claiming it made everyone uncomfortable. But Marcus had always been a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts had been screaming at him for years. The winters were getting harsher. The power grid was aging and unreliable. Supply chains were fragile. He wasn't preparing for some Hollywood apocalypse scenario. He was preparing for the kind of disaster that actually happens to real people, the kind that leaves families freezing in the dark, scrambling for food and water, wondering why they never thought to plan ahead. Marcus had seen it happen before, in smaller ways. He'd lived through the ice storm of '98 as a kid, remembered his mother's fear when the power stayed out for 9 days and the temperature inside their house dropped to near freezing. He'd sworn to himself then that if he ever had the means, he'd never be that vulnerable again. So when he'd inherited a piece of land from his grandfather, along with a modest sum of money, Marcus knew exactly what he was going to do with it. He was going to build a shelter, not a flimsy prefab bunker from some survivalist catalog, but a proper, well-engineered underground home, capable of sustaining him and his family through any crisis. He was going to do it right with real planning, real materials, and real expertise. The first step had been the location. Marcus had chosen a spot on his property that was slightly elevated, ensuring good drainage, but protected from wind by a natural ridge of rock. He'd hired a geological surveyor despite the cost to make sure the ground was stable and suitable for underground construction. The surveyor had looked at him like he was insane when Marcus explained what he wanted, but the man had done his job professionally, and the results had been promising. The soil composition was ideal, with a good mix of clay and rock that would provide natural stability and insulation. Next came the excavation. Marcus had saved money by doing much of the labor himself, but he'd hired professionals for the heavy machinery work. Over the course of 2 months, they dug out a space that measured 40 feet long, 25 feet wide, and 12 feet deep. It was larger than most people would have guessed, large enough to include separate areas for sleeping, living, storage, and utilities. The excavation had been the part that really got the neighbors talking. Huge amounts of earth being moved, the constant rumble of machinery, the growing pit in Marcus's backyard. One neighbor had actually called the county to complain, certain that Marcus was doing something illegal. The inspector who'd shown up had been surprised to find that Marcus had all his permits in order, every single one of them, properly filed and approved. The foundation and walls had come next, and this was where Marcus had refused to cut corners. He'd used reinforced concrete, steel reinforced to be precise, with walls that were 18 inches thick at their thinnest point. The concrete had been poured in sections carefully with proper curing time between each pour. He'd hired a structural engineer to review his plans, and the engineer had been impressed despite himself. "If you're going to do something crazy," the man had said, "at least you're doing it right." But the real genius of Marcus's shelter wasn't just in its structural integrity. It was in the insulation and climate control system he'd designed. This was what would make the difference between a cold concrete box and a genuinely comfortable living space. Marcus had researched extensively, studying everything from traditional root cellar design to cutting-edge green building techniques. He'd learned about thermal mass, about how Earth itself could be used as a temperature regulator, about the constant temperature that exists just a few feet below the surface year-round. The walls of his shelter had been wrapped in multiple layers of insulation. First, a waterproofing membrane to keep moisture out. Then, 6 inches of closed-cell spray foam insulation with an R value of nearly 40. Over that, rigid foam boards added another layer of protection. Finally, an air gap and an interior wall of insulated panels that could be easily removed for maintenance. The ceiling had received even more attention, with 10 inches of insulation, because Marcus knew that heat rises and that the ceiling would be his biggest potential heat loss point. The floor had been equally important. Marcus had installed a layer of rigid foam insulation under the concrete slab, breaking the thermal bridge between the shelter and the cold earth below. Then he'd added radiant heating tubes in the concrete itself, connected to a system that could use either electricity or a backup propane heater. Over the concrete, he'd installed subfloor panels and then engineered hardwood, creating a floor that felt warm and comfortable underfoot rather than cold and clammy like bare concrete. Temperature control, however, was about more than just insulation. It was about air circulation and ventilation, and this was where Marcus had really done his homework. An underground space with poor ventilation would quickly become unbearable, filled with stale air, excess moisture, and carbon dioxide. Marcus had installed a sophisticated ventilation system with multiple components. Fresh air intakes were disguised as natural landscape features, positioned to avoid snow blockage, and equipped with filters to keep out dust and debris. The air was drawn in through a long, serpentine underground pipe that allowed the earth itself to precondition it, warming cold outside air in winter and cooling hot air in summer. This technique, called an earth tube or ground-coupled heat exchanger, was ancient in concept but incredibly effective. Inside the shelter, a heat recovery ventilator constantly exchanged stale air for fresh, while capturing the heat from the outgoing air and transferring it to the incoming air. This meant Marcus could have fresh air without losing all his heat in the process. The system was quiet, efficient, and could run on minimal power. He'd also installed a backup manual ventilation system, simple vents that could be opened by hand if the power ever failed completely, because Marcus believed in redundancy for critical systems. Power was another crucial consideration. Marcus had installed a hybrid system that drew from multiple sources. On the surface, disguised among the trees, he'd mounted solar panels on adjustable racks that could be angled to capture the low winter sun. These fed into a substantial battery bank housed in an insulated box in a separate underground chamber connected to the main shelter by a short tunnel. The batteries were lithium iron phosphate, expensive but long-lasting and safe. They could store enough power to run the shelter's essential systems for several days without any input from the solar panels. But Marcus hadn't stopped there. He'd also installed a propane generator for backup power, housed in another small chamber with its own ventilation to keep exhaust away from the living space. The generator was high quality, designed for continuous operation, and could run for weeks on the 1,000-gallon propane tank he'd buried nearby. He'd even added a small wind turbine on the property, though it was more experimental than essential. The turbine could provide supplemental power during the windy months, but Marcus had designed his system so that it wasn't dependent on any single power source. If one failed, the others could compensate. Water had been perhaps the most challenging aspect of the entire project. You can't live underground without water, and you can't rely on municipal systems during a disaster. Marcus had drilled a well, going down 200 feet to reach a reliable aquifer. The well water was pure and cold, tested regularly to ensure it remained safe. He'd installed a high-quality pump system with a backup hand pump as well, just in case. The water was stored in several large tanks inside the shelter, giving him a reserve of several hundred gallons at any given time. A sophisticated filtration system ensured the water was always clean and safe to drink. But water coming in was only half the equation. Water going out was equally important. Marcus had installed a proper septic system, compliant with all local codes, with the tank positioned at the correct depth and distance from the well. Inside the shelter, he had a full bathroom with a composting toilet as a backup option, low-flow fixtures to conserve water, and a gray water system that could recycle water from sinks and showers for use in his small underground garden. Yes, a garden. This was one of Marcus's favorite features, and one that had required significant planning. He dedicated a section of the shelter to growing food under full-spectrum LED grow lights. The lights were energy efficient, running on timers to simulate natural day-night cycles. He'd built raised beds with proper drainage, filled them with high-quality soil mixed with compost, and had successfully grown lettuce, herbs, tomatoes, and even strawberries. It wasn't enough to feed himself completely, but it provided fresh vegetables and a psychological boost. There was something deeply comforting about growing living things underground, about having green plants to tend and harvest. Food storage was extensive. Marcus had lined one entire wall with industrial shelving, the kind designed for warehouses, sturdy and efficient. On those shelves sat carefully organized containers of dried goods, canned foods, vacuum-sealed packages, and jarred preserves. He'd calculated his needs carefully, aiming for at least 6 months of food for 2 people, knowing that he might need to help his daughter Sarah if something serious happened. She thought he was overreacting too, but she at least humored him, unlike most of his family. The food wasn't just random cans thrown on shelves. Marcus had organized it by type and rotation date. He'd labeled everything clearly, created an inventory system on his computer, and made sure to actually eat and replace items so nothing would expire. He had proteins, grains, fruits, vegetables, oils, spices, comfort foods, and even some treats. He'd learned about proper storage conditions, keeping everything in a cool, dry area of the shelter where temperature and humidity remained stable. Some preppers just hoarded food without thinking about variety or nutrition, but Marcus had consulted with a nutritionist to ensure his stockpile would actually keep him healthy long-term. Beyond food and water, Marcus had stocked medical supplies, tools, spare parts for every critical system, warm clothing, blankets, books for entertainment, and a comprehensive library of survival and repair manuals both in print and digital form. He had a radio capable of receiving emergency broadcasts, a satellite phone for when cell towers might be down, and multiple fire extinguishers because underground fires would be catastrophic. He'd thought through scenarios, played out mental simulations, identified vulnerabilities and addressed them. Every time he found a potential weakness in his system, he fixed it. The living space itself was surprisingly comfortable. Marcus had put effort into making it feel like a home rather than a bunker. The walls were painted in warm light colors to combat the closed-in feeling. He'd installed good lighting, a mix of task lights and ambient fixtures that could be dimmed to create different moods. There was a comfortable couch, a real bed with a good mattress, a small desk for working, a kitchenette with a propane stove, and a small refrigerator that could run on either electricity or propane. He'd hung pictures on the walls, brought in plants, added small touches that made the space feel human. Because Marcus understood something that many preppers missed. Surviving isn't just about having the right equipment, it's about maintaining your mental health and morale. A miserable shelter that keeps you alive physically, but destroys you psychologically, isn't a real solution. The entrance to the shelter was cleverly concealed. From outside, it looked like a small storage shed, the kind that might hold garden tools or a lawnmower. But inside the shed, a section of the floor lifted up to reveal a staircase descending into the earth. The stairs were wide and safe, with good handrails and non-slip treads. The hatch itself was heavy, insulated, and could be locked from inside with multiple mechanisms including a manual override in case the electronic lock failed. Marcus had also installed a security camera system that let him see outside without exposing himself, and motion sensors that would alert him to anyone approaching. For 3 years, this incredible shelter sat there, perfectly functional, carefully maintained, and completely unused except for Marcus's regular inspections and system tests. And for 3 years, the mockery continued. People in town had started calling it Marcus's mole hole behind his back. At the diner, there was a running joke about him waiting for the end of the world in his underground bunker. When he'd tried to date again after his divorce, women would Google him and find out about his shelter project, and suddenly they'd stop returning his calls. He'd become the town eccentric, the weird guy with the bunker, the man who couldn't let go of his paranoia. Marcus tried not to let it bother him. He had his work as a civil engineer, which paid well and gave him professional respect even if his personal projects raised eyebrows. He had his daughter, who visited occasionally, and a few genuine friends who didn't judge him too harshly. He had his shelter, which gave him peace of mind, and he had his convictions, his certainty that he was doing the right thing, even if no one else could see it. Then came the winter of 2024, and everything changed. The signs started in early December. The meteorologists were tracking an unusual weather pattern developing over Alaska, a massive cold front, combining with moisture from the Pacific to create what they were calling a potentially historic storm system. The computer models were inconsistent, some predicting the storm would dissipate, others showing it strengthening as it moved south. By mid-December, the forecasts were getting more alarming. This wasn't going to be a normal winter storm. This was going to be something unprecedented. Marcus watched the weather reports with growing concern. He checked his shelter systems, topped off his fuel, made sure his food stocks were fresh. He tried to warn a few people in town, suggested they might want to prepare for an extended power outage. But most just smiled and nodded in that condescending way people do when they think you're overreacting. It's Montana, Marcus. We know how to handle snow. They'd lived through blizzards before. They had fireplaces, generators, four-wheel drives. They'd be fine. But Marcus studied the data more carefully than they did. He saw the combination of factors that made this storm different. The temperature predictions weren't just cold, they were Arctic-level cold, with wind chills potentially reaching 60 below zero. The snow accumulation forecasts were staggering, 3 to 5 feet in the first wave, with potential for more in subsequent storms. And most ominously, the storm was predicted to stall over the region, sitting there for days instead of blowing through quickly. That meant sustained extreme cold, sustained heavy snow, and most critically, sustained stress on the power grid and supply chains. He called Sarah, who lived 2 hours away in the city. "I think you should come stay with me for a while," he told her. "This storm is going to be bad." "Dad, I'm not coming to hide in your bunker because of some snow," she said, affection mixed with exasperation in her voice. "I'll be fine. My apartment building has backup generators." "Sarah, please. I have a bad feeling about this one." "You always have a bad feeling. That's kind of your thing." He couldn't argue with that. "Just promise me you'll keep your phone charged and your car gassed up. And if things get bad, you come here immediately. Don't wait." "I promise, Dad, but it's going to be fine." The storm hit on December 19th, 3 days before Christmas. It hit harder and faster than even the worst predictions had suggested. Marcus was in town getting a few last-minute supplies when the first bands of snow began to fall. Within an hour, visibility had dropped to near zero. Within 3 hours, the roads were becoming impassable. Marcus made it home safely, his truck pushing through snow that was already 6 inches deep and accumulating fast. By evening, the power started flickering. By midnight, it went out completely. Marcus was already in his shelter by then, having moved down as soon as he got home. He sat in his comfortable living room, at a comfortable 70 degrees, eating a hot meal cooked on his propane stove, listening to the wind howl above ground. On his battery-powered weather radio, he heard the emergency broadcasts. The entire region was without power. The storm had taken down transmission lines, snapped power poles like matchsticks, and overloaded the grid beyond its capacity to recover. Power crews couldn't even get out to assess the damage, let alone repair it, because the roads were impassable and the wind was too dangerous. The temperature outside plummeted, 20 below, 30 below. The wind chill pushed it down past 50 below zero. In town, people huddled around fireplaces and propane heaters, bundled in every piece of clothing they owned. Those lucky enough to have generators ran them constantly, burning through fuel at an alarming rate. But generators need ventilation, and ventilation means letting in cold air, so houses stayed cold even with the generators running. Pipes began to freeze despite people's best efforts to keep water flowing. Some pipes burst, flooding homes with water that then froze solid. The snow didn't stop. It fell for 48 hours straight, accumulating to depths that made even snowplows useless. The plows that tried to get out found themselves stuck or unable to move the sheer volume of snow. The main highway into town became completely blocked, then the secondary roads. Then the streets themselves became impassable. The town was cut off, isolated, trapped under a blanket of snow with no power and no way to get help in or out. Marcus monitored the situation through his radio and his satellite internet connection. He watched the news reports, the growing desperation in people's voices. The emergency shelters in town were overwhelmed, packed with people who'd left their homes seeking warmth. The shelters had backup power, but they were running low on fuel, low on food, low on space. The hospital was in crisis mode, dealing with cases of hypothermia, frostbite, carbon monoxide poisoning from people running generators improperly, heart attacks from people shoveling snow in the extreme cold. His phone rang on the third day. It was Sarah, and her voice was small and frightened in a way he'd never heard before. "Dad? The power's been out for 2 days. My building's generators ran out of fuel this morning. It's so cold. I can see my breath inside my apartment. I don't know what to do." "Can you get to your car?" "I think so. The parking garage is sheltered." "Then come to me, right now, don't wait." "Dad, the roads—" "I know. But you have 4-wheel drive and you're a good driver. Take the back roads, the ones the plows would have hit first. Drive slow, keep your phone on so I can track you. But you need to leave now, Sarah. It's only going to get worse." She made it. It took her 5 hours to travel 30 miles, but she made it, pulling up to his property just as darkness was falling. Marcus was waiting at the surface, bundled in extreme cold weather gear, and he helped her quickly down into the shelter. She'd been crying. He could see the tear tracks on her frozen face, but she was safe now. Inside the shelter, Sarah stood in stunned silence. It was warm. Not just survivably warm, but actually comfortable. The temperature gauge on the wall read 71 degrees. The lights were on, bright and steady. Music was playing softly from speakers. There was a pot of chili simmering on the stove, filling the air with a rich, homey smell. She could hear the gentle hum of the ventilation system, feel the slight movement of fresh air across her skin. She looked around at the living space that was clean, organized, comfortable, at the shelves stocked with food, at the plants growing under their lights, at her father who was looking at her with a mixture of relief and an carefully suppressed "I told you so" expression. "Dad," she said quietly, "everyone called you crazy. I know. But this is incredible. How is it so warm? How do you have power?" He explained the systems to her, walking her through the shelter, showing her how everything worked. She asked questions, intelligent questions, and he could see her mind working, understanding dawning on her face. This wasn't luck. This wasn't accident. This was the result of years of planning, learning, building, preparing. Her crazy father had been right all along. Above ground, the storm continued. Day 4, Day 5, Day 6. The temperature stayed brutally cold. More snow fell. People in town were running out of food. The stores had been cleaned out in panic buying before the storm, and now there was no way to resupply. People were burning furniture to stay warm. Some were trying to leave, abandoning their homes to make for bigger cities where surely there must be help. But most of those attempts ended with cars stuck in snowdrifts and people hiking back home through the deadly cold, lucky to survive. Emergency responders were doing their best, but they were overwhelmed and working in impossible conditions. The National Guard was trying to get through, but even their heavy equipment was struggling with the snow depths and the ongoing whiteout conditions. Helicopters couldn't fly in the winds. The region was essentially cut off from the outside world. In his shelter, Marcus and Sarah were comfortable. They ate well, stayed warm, maintained their routines. Marcus continued his daily exercises, read his books, tended his plants. Sarah worked remotely on her laptop when she could get satellite internet, amazed that she could conduct business meetings from an underground shelter in the middle of a historic blizzard. They talked, really talked, in a way they hadn't in years. She asked him about the divorce, about why he'd become so focused on preparing, about what drove him. He opened up, sharing fears and hopes he'd kept inside for too long. "I wasn't preparing because I thought the world was ending," he told her one evening as they played cards by the soft light of his LED lamps. "I was preparing because I knew the world would keep going, but it would throw challenges at us, and I wanted to be ready, I wanted to protect the people I love. After your mother left, after I felt like I'd failed at protecting our family in the ways that mattered, this was something concrete I could do. I could build something solid, something real, something that would keep us safe no matter what. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. I'm sorry I called you crazy. You weren't wrong. By normal standards, I probably am a little crazy. No, you're prepared. There's a difference. On day 7, Marcus heard knocking on his hatch. He checked his security camera and saw his neighbor, Tom, the same man who'd made jokes about the mole hole, standing at his surface entrance. Tom looked terrible, even through the low-resolution camera, his face haggard and his body hunched with cold, despite the layers of clothing. Marcus opened the hatch. Marcus, Tom's voice cracked. My wife and kids, we're out of propane. The house is freezing. We've been burning everything we can, but I was wrong about everything. I know I laughed at you. I know I was a jerk. But please, my kids are so cold. Marcus didn't hesitate. Bring them over. Now. All of you. But we can't impose. Tom, bring your family here right now or I'm going to come drag them here myself. Move. 20 minutes later, Tom's wife and 2 young children were in the shelter, wrapped in warm blankets, sipping hot cocoa, staring around them like they'd entered another world. The kids, ages 6 and 8, kept asking if they were in a spaceship. Tom sat with his face in his hands, overcome with relief and shame and gratitude. I have enough supplies for a few more people, Marcus said gently. You can stay as long as you need to. Why are you helping us? Tom asked. After how I treated you. Because that's what neighbors do. That's what people do. This shelter isn't just for me. It's for whoever needs it when things go wrong. Word spread somehow despite the lack of cell service and internet for most people. Probably Tom mentioned it on a trip back home to get some belongings, or someone saw the family heading to Marcus's property. More people came. Marcus couldn't take everyone. His shelter had limits, but he helped where he could. He shared food with those who were running out. He let people charge phones and medical devices from his power system. He provided warm water in thermoses for families to take home. He gave advice on how to stay warm, how to conserve fuel, how to make their supplies last. The shelter that everyone had mocked became a lifeline for the neighborhood. It became proof that preparing wasn't paranoia, it was wisdom. It became a symbol of what's possible when you think ahead, when you take responsibility for your own safety and the safety of your loved ones. The storm finally broke on day 9. The wind stopped howling. The snow stopped falling. The sun emerged, blindingly bright against all that white. The temperature began to slowly climb, though it would be weeks before it reached anything close to normal. Power crews began the massive work of restoration. Roads were cleared, slowly, laboriously. Supply trucks got through. The National Guard arrived with fuel and food and medical supplies. Marcus emerged from his shelter to find a changed world. Not just the physical landscape buried under feet of snow, but the social landscape. People looked at him differently now. They nodded with respect. They stopped him on the street to thank him, to apologize for doubting him, to ask questions about his shelter and his preparation. Some asked for advice, genuinely wanting to learn. A few asked if he'd be willing to consult on their own projects, to help them build something similar. The local news heard about the story and wanted to do a feature. Marcus was reluctant, never having sought attention, but Sarah convinced him. Dad, people need to hear this. Not to make you famous, but because your story could help others, it could save lives. The news segment aired a month later. It was balanced and thoughtful, showing Marcus's shelter with respect rather than mockery, interviewing him seriously, letting him explain his philosophy and his methods. The reporter asked the key question. Do you feel vindicated? Do you want to say I told you so to all the people who doubted you? Marcus thought carefully before answering. No, I don't feel vindicated. I feel grateful that I was able to help. And I feel sad that people had to suffer to learn this lesson. I wish everyone had been prepared. I wish no one had been cold or hungry or scared. The point of preparing isn't to be right, it's to be safe. It's to have options when others don't. It's to be able to help your neighbors instead of competing with them for scarce resources. What would you say to people watching this who are thinking about preparing themselves? I'd say start small. You don't need to build an underground shelter like mine. Start with a week's worth of food and water. Get a good first aid kit. Have a backup heat source. Make a plan for what you'd do if the power went out for a few days. Learn some basic skills. Preparing isn't about fear, it's about taking responsibility for yourself and your family. It's about having peace of mind. And it's about being part of the solution instead of part of the problem when things go wrong. In the months that followed, Marcus found himself with unexpected opportunities. An engineering firm specializing in resilient design hired him as a consultant. He began working on shelter and emergency housing projects professionally, bringing his personal experience to bear on official initiatives. He started teaching classes at the community center on basic preparedness, and they were always full. He wrote articles for survival and homesteading magazines. He even got invitations to speak at conferences. But more importantly, his relationship with Sarah deepened. She'd experienced firsthand what it meant to be unprepared, and what it meant to have her father ready to help her. She started making her own preparations in her city apartment, building an emergency kit, storing food and water, thinking through scenarios. She called him regularly for advice, and those calls would drift into longer conversations about life and family and the future. She brought friends to visit the shelter, showing off her dad's creation with pride. Tom and his family became close friends. Tom helped Marcus with maintenance on the shelter, learning the systems, becoming a capable backup operator. Tom started his own preparation, not as extensive as Marcus's, but thoughtful and practical. Other neighbors followed suit, some building small shelters, others just improving their emergency supplies and backup systems. The community as a whole became more resilient, more capable of handling the next crisis. Because Marcus understood something important, there would be a next crisis. Maybe not as dramatic as the blizzard, but something. That's how the world works. Systems fail, weather gets extreme, accidents happen, supply chains break down. And when those moments come, you're either ready or you're not. You either have options or you don't. You either maintained your agency and can help others, or you're dependent on others helping you. The shelter remained his refuge and his workshop, constantly being improved and upgraded. He added a small woodworking shop in a new chamber, expanding his skills and his ability to repair and create. He upgraded his solar panels to newer, more efficient models. He added a rainwater collection system to supplement his well. He experimented with aquaponics, raising fish and plants in a closed-loop system. He built a small sauna, because why not have some luxury in his underground home? But the most important upgrade wasn't technical. It was philosophical. Marcus had built the shelter initially out of fear and a sense of personal failure, a need to control something in a world that felt chaotic. But through the experience of the blizzard and its aftermath, the shelter had become something else. It had become a gift to his community, a resource for others, a teaching tool, a bridge to his daughter. It had become less about hiding from the world and more about being prepared to engage with the world on his own terms, from a position of strength and capability. Years later, Marcus would give tours of his shelter to curious groups, and someone always asked the same question. Do you think the storm vindicated your decision to build this? And Marcus's answer was always the same. The storm didn't vindicate anything. The storm just revealed what was already true. Being prepared is always the right decision. You don't need a disaster to prove that. You need wisdom to see it before the disaster comes. The lesson of Marcus's shelter isn't that everyone should build an underground bunker. Most people don't have the land, the money, or the inclination for such a project. The lesson is deeper and more universal. It's about taking responsibility for your own welfare and the welfare of those you love. It's about thinking ahead, learning skills, storing supplies, having plans. It's about understanding that modern life, for all its conveniences, is more fragile than we like to admit. We're one storm, one power outage, one supply chain disruption away from serious problems. And in those moments, the difference between suffering and comfort, between danger and safety, often comes down to what you did before the crisis arrived. Marcus's story is a reminder that the people society calls crazy are sometimes the only sane ones in the room. The people who see risks others dismiss, who take precautions others mock, who invest time and money in things others consider wasteful, those people are often the ones who keep going when everyone else falls apart. They're not paranoid. They're not obsessed. They're simply awake to realities that others prefer to ignore. In the end, Marcus's underground shelter, the one that stayed at 71 degrees while the world above froze, was never really about the temperature. It was about dignity, about maintaining your humanity in the face of chaos, about having the power to help others instead of needing help yourself, about proving that with knowledge, planning, and effort, you can create safety in an unsafe world. You can build something that stands firm when everything else falls apart. You can turn mockery into respect not by arguing or explaining, but simply by being right when it matters most. The shelter still sits there 20 feet underground, temperature-controlled, well-stocked, quietly maintained. Marcus doesn't talk about it as much anymore. He doesn't need to. The people who matter understand. And the next time something goes wrong, whether it's another blizzard, a power grid failure, or some crisis we can't yet imagine, Marcus will be ready. And so will an ever-growing number of people he's influenced and taught. Because that's the real legacy of the shelter. Not the concrete and steel and insulation, but the idea it represents. That ordinary people can take extraordinary responsibility for themselves. That preparation is an act of love for your family and your community. And that the best time to get ready for disaster is long before anyone thinks it's coming. If you found Marcus's story compelling, if it made you think about your own level of preparedness or inspired you to take steps toward greater self-reliance, then you understand the value of learning from people who've walked this path before. The world is unpredictable, and the challenges we face are only growing more complex. But knowledge and preparation can make all the difference between thriving and merely surviving. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories of survival, resilience, and the kind of practical wisdom that can genuinely change your life when you need it most. Hit that subscribe button now, because the next story could be the one that gives you the insight or inspiration you need for your own journey towards safety, security, and peace of mind. Your future self will thank you for taking that small step today.